I'm back with my horribly blended extensions. Y'all know you love it. You don't gotta be so rude. All right, so in this episode of Makeup and History, I'm going to speak on the Sodder children disappearance or the mystery surrounding them. This was requested by Synthetic Fate on my previous video, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So for anybody who's interested in that, it's a frustrating story, but it's a good story, so I definitely recommend it. So I've already done one episode pertaining to West Virginia history, and I plan on maybe doing these like once or twice a month, kind of whenever the feeling hits me. I love West Virginia. I'm from West Virginia, so you know, I have a lot of interest, especially in our history. Now, this story dates all the way back to Christmas Eve, 1945. It's still kind of disputed as to what happened to them. The case is very interesting, and I will leave any sources as well as the makeup that I use in the description. As many people in older generations than me may remember, there used to be a billboard along State Route 16 that had the pictures of the missing 5 Sodder children on it, and it was up until 1989, not long after their mother, Jenny Sodder, died. This had become like a landmark. I mean, I've heard people talk about this billboard before, and there's pictures of it online, which I'll probably try to put one over here somewhere. And there have been many theories as to what happened to them. Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? And did they die on Christmas Eve? Without further ado, let's get into it. No, you don't. Thank you. George Sodder, who was originally born Giorgio Sodder in Sardinia, an Italian island in the Mediterranean Sea, in 1895, came to Ellis Island with his brother at age 13. Basically, as soon as they arrived, his brother turned around and went back to Italy, and this left young George all by himself, age 13, in a new country in 1908. He worked in Pennsylvania in the railroad industry, and later moved to Smithers, West Virginia, where he met his future wife, Jenny Cipriani. Not long after this, they married. The couple would go on to have 11 children. The names of their 11 children were John, Joseph, Mary, George, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, Sylvia, and Michael. The only way I was able to find the fact that Michael had existed and was one of their children was on the Find a Grave website. His information was listed. It was connected to George's and had him in the children category. So, and I mean, obviously they don't feel the need to mention him in the stories pertaining to the Sodder children because he was born afterwards. He was born and died on December 30th, 1951. The family settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, or Fayetteville, because we pronounce everything differently. It just kind of depends on who you ask. They became part of a thriving Italian community there. Now, the Sodder family, they were a very well-respected middle-class family. George was known for his very outspoken opinion against the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and this often incited some intense arguments amongst the members of the community. Joseph, during this time, left to go serve in World War II. And about a year after he left, Mussolini was deposed and he was executed. Now, George seemed to be pleased by this, and even though Mussolini was now dead, his remarks about the leader had left some open wounds within the community. In October of 1945, the Sodder family had a visit with a life insurance salesman. Now, once he realized that his sale was probably not going to happen, he became infuriated. He told George that his house, quote, would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, end quote. Now, on Christmas Eve 1945, George, Jenny, and 9 of their children were at home, and they had spent the evening celebrating. Around 12:30, they got a phone call, and Jenny went and answered it. She said that the caller was a woman, and she didn't recognize who it was, but she heard laughter and clinking glasses in the background. She told them that they had the wrong number. Jenny hung up and went to bed. She noticed that whenever she was going to bed that the lights were still on and that the curtains weren't drawn. She ended up closing the curtains and turning off the lights and went back to bed. So around half an hour later, Jenny was awakened by the sound of something hitting the roof. She said she heard a loud bang and then a rolling sound. After a while of not hearing anything else, she went back to sleep. An hour after the phone call and half an hour after hearing the object hit the roof, Jenny awoke to the smell of smoke. Now, she went into George's office and noticed that it was on fire around the telephone line and the fuse box. She went and woke him up, and he went to go wake up his older children. Because of Jenny's quick action, both parents made it outside, as well as 4 of their children. Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. They were able to get out. Now, while outside, they were freaking out trying to get the attention of the other children that were left upstairs in the house. John originally said that he had went upstairs to the attic to let his siblings know what was happening, but later on, he ended up changing his story, saying that he had only called up to them. Now, they could not reach the other 5 children because the staircase was already on fire. After realizing that 5 of his children were still inside, George broke a window to try to reach them, and he ended up slicing his arm, not even caring that he was bleeding or anything like that, in a desperate attempt to save those children. He ended up having to retreat from the house again because there was too much smoke and too much fire. There was no way he could see anything. He was going to use his ladder to try to reach the upstairs bedrooms to try to rescue the children, but his ladder was missing. He had always kept it in the same place, and it wasn't there. Now, he had 2 coal trucks, and he had the idea to use them to try to, climb into them and get into the house that way. But even though they were in perfect functioning order the previous day, they weren't working. He even went so far as to try to scoop water into a bucket and pour it on the fire, but he found that it was frozen. Marion went to a neighbor's house to try to call the fire department, but she couldn't reach anyone. Oh my god, that is bright. Oh wow. Oh well, we're going to have a grungy glow moment. Oh man, that's bright, she says as she packs on more. I like to be glowy, okay? Shine bright like my forehead. It's not my joke, that's my fiance's joke. A neighbor who had also seen the fire drove to a nearby tavern to try to call the fire department as well, but they also couldn't get a response. After that, the neighbor drove to town to find the fire chief, F.J. Morris, and he got in touch with other members of the fire department to come to the property. Even though the fire department was only about 2 miles away, they didn't arrive until about 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire started. And by this time, the Sodders' house was just burnt to the ground. Here's where the weird part comes in. George and Jenny originally believed that the remaining 5 children were dead. But after a search of the property, no remains turned up. Morris originally suggested that the fire may have been hot enough that it totally cremated the remains of all 5 children. And they blamed the blaze on faulty wiring. But George totally rejected this idea because not long ago he had had his home inspected and the wiring was said to be in perfect working condition. So he was not going to take that as an answer. Now, George eventually covered the basement with dirt, and he intended to make this a memorial for his children who had perished in the fire. The coroner's office issued 5 death certificates for the children, and their cause of death was listed as fire or suffocation. But it didn't take long for people to begin to speculate. When recounting the events that led up to the fire, George and the children remembered some weird things happening. Now, on top of the wiring being certified completely fine, they remembered that threat issued by that life insurance salesman. Just before the fire, they had noticed a man parked along Highway 21 watching the younger children as they came home from school, which is weird. And you remember the daughter, Jenny, she had also answered a phone call from an unknown person laughing. It was kind of freaky. Now the mother, Jenny, she didn't understand how 5 children could die in a fire and leave no sign that they were even there. She began to conduct experiments with a bunch of different things, like chicken bones, to see if fire would completely destroy them. Now, each time she was left with burnt bones. Now, whenever they had investigated the basement initially after the fire, they noticed that some household appliances were still identifiable. She had also spoken to someone at a crematorium, an employee, about the possibility of her children being completely cremated in the house fire. The employee said that bones usually remain after bodies are cremated. They usually did their cremations for 2 hours at approximately 2,000 degrees, and their house was only destroyed in about 45 minutes, so less than an hour. So with these odd occurrences that happened before the fire and them not finding any remains, they began to question and speculate as to what actually happened and if the fire was really caused by faulty wiring. Oh no, I did it again, guys. Now, when it comes to the issue of faulty wiring, ignore that spot on my eye, not only was the Sodder home given the okay whenever they had it inspected, but rooms downstairs also had lights on. If it was due to faulty wiring, the power would have been out. Later on, a witness came forward whenever it pertained to the fact that George's trucks wouldn't start, and said that he had seen someone with a block and tackle used for removing car engines around the property. You hear any tapping? That's my fiance. He's in here. You're fine. One of these days I'll get my wings even on here, I swear. While they were searching their property, their toddler Sylvia found a rubber object in the yard. And Jenny recalled that she had heard something hit the roof and make a thud sound, in hearing the rolling sound before the fire. George figured that it must be what they call a napalm pineapple bomb. Eventually, word of sightings began to spread. A woman claimed to witness the missing children peering from a passing car as the fire was happening. In 1947, George and Jenny Sodder ended up sending a letter to the FBI, and they ended up receiving a reply from J. Edgar Hoover, and he says, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau," end quote. His agents said that they would investigate with permission from local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments both declined. Here's where a private detective comes in. Now, the investigator, C.C. Tinsley, he discovered that the life insurance salesman who had previously threatened George Sodder and his family was part of the coroner's jury that deemed the fire to be accidental. Rumors also began circulating that the fire chief, F.J. Morris, had confided in a Fayetteville minister that he had found the heart of one of the children and hid it in a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. Now, Tinsley convinced Morris to show him the spot that was in question. They dug up the box together and brought it to a local funeral director. Now, the funeral director, he examined the heart and determined that it was beef liver, and it was completely free of fire damage. Soon after, they began to hear rumors involving the heart again, but this time it consisted of F.J. Morris not finding the contents in the fire, but he had placed it there with the hopes of making the family calm down and basically just forget about their kids. Over the years, there were many different tips and claims of sightings, and George typically fervently investigated these. George had seen a photo of schoolgirls in New York, and he was convinced that one of them was eerily similar to his daughter Betty. He even went as far as to drive to Manhattan to try to track the girl down, but the parents refused to speak to him. The Sodders' next move was to investigate the rubble at the fire, and they organized an excavation with the help of a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. During the excavation, they uncovered quite a few different things, like household objects, books. Some of these things did show signs of fire damage, as well as several shards of vertebrae. Now, Mr. Hunter decided to send these bones to the Smithsonian, and they conducted an analysis of them. And this is a segment from the report that they issued. Quote, "The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, The age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22, since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17 maturation. Now, these bones did not show any kind of sign that they were exposed to fire. And the report went on to say, quote, "It is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful excavation of the basement of the house." They also stated that since the house had only burned for about an hour and a half, it is said that, quote, "One would expect to find the full skeletal remains of the 5 children rather than only 4 vertebrae." They determined that these bones had probably come from the dirt that George had moved to construct the memorial for his children. After the report, 2 hearings were conducted, but the West Virginia governor at the time, Oki L. Patterson, and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett said that the Sodders' search was basically, it's just not gonna turn up with anything. They said that it was hopeless, and they decided that the case was closed. Now, this is where the famous billboard comes in. After they had declared it closed, George and Jenny decided to erect the billboard on US Route 16, displaying the children. They also began offering a $5,000 reward for any information that would help them recover their children. There was speculation that Martha was in a convent in St. Louis, and another person came forward with information that they had overheard a conversation about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia, and that conversation was incriminating. Each time new information came forward, George made sure to travel to where the lead came from so he could do his own kind of investigation. He made sure to follow up with every lead that he could, and he always came home with nothing, empty-handed. Jenny would receive a letter in the mail addressed only to her in 1968 with a photo said to be Louis Sodder. It was postmarked in Kentucky, but there was no return address. Inside, it said, quote, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illil boys, ILIL boys, A90132 or 35. The man in the picture they felt really did resemble Louis, but he was 9 at the time of the fire, so there was no real way that they could tell what he would possibly look like as an adult. The two did have similarities, like their hair and their dark eyes, and some of the same facial features, but they hired a private investigator, and I believe that they gave him $10,000, and they sent him to Kentucky to investigate. Homeboy just disappeared. The investigator just poofed. They never heard from him ever again. George would later go on to say in an interview, quote, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." George Sodder died in 1968 with no answers for what happened to his children. Jenny Sodder died in 1989, and not long after the billboard was taken down. Her children and grandchildren continued to investigate and began to formulate theories of their own. But the youngest and the last remaining member of the original Sodder family that were involved in the accident on that night, Sylvia, she doesn't believe that they died in the fire. Her first memories are of the fire. She said in an interview that she will never forget the sight of her father bleeding or everyone's screams as they desperately tried to call to the children. She visits crime websites and tries to get any information that she can. Many of George and Jenny's grandchildren, they have come up with theories involving like the mob, and like they weren't able to contact their parents because they wanted to protect them if it really was Louis in that picture. It's really complicated. In an interview with the Charleston Gazette, Sylvia stated, quote, "I was the last one of the kids to leave home. I experienced their grief for a long time." And her daughter said in an interview as well in 2006, quote, "She promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die and that she would do everything that she could." George Bragg, who wrote about the case in West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, he believes that John was telling the truth in his first account, where he says that he physically went upstairs to wake up his siblings. He also states that that conclusion may still not be correct. Quote, logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic. Whatever else I can find on this story, I will do my best to leave resources for, and I mean, it's unsolved. There's really no good way to end this. It's weird, it's sad, it's complicated. There isn't only the missing children, there's also that missing private investigator and that weird life insurance salesman. It's a lot of what's in that story. Sylvia, as far as I know, is still alive and still doing research. If you guys hear any new developments, please let me know. All right, I think this is going to be it for today's Makeup in History. I really hope you guys enjoyed. Look at my face. I know that it probably isn't like my most organized video, and I apologize. It's just been a day. Hope you guys enjoyed, and if you like this, make sure to leave a like and possibly consider subscribing. I would love to have you here, and I'm always open to suggestions on different topics. I am here to try to spread kindness and educate people on your history because it is incredibly important, and I also just like to kind of chill and do my makeup too. See you guys next time.